and it's great to be here. As Margot mentioned, we're talking about technology, data collection and the future of sport from an ethical and moral point of view, and we've got a great panel to introduce. First of all, Associate Professor Jacqueline Alderson. Jackie leads the National, International Sport and Health focused research teams in wearable tech, machine learning and pro-public technology applications at UWA. We've also got Angus Armstrong, who's a young man who is a pole vaulter training at the WA Institute of Sport. Angus is a two-time Australian Open champion and currently aiming towards next year's Tokyo Olympic Games. Julia Powles, another Associate Professor on our panel, is Director of the Minderoo Tech and Policy Lab and Associate Professor of Law and Technology at UWA, and she specialises in privacy, intellectual property and governance. And finally, Jason Webber. Jason's been at the forefront of high-performance management, strength and conditioning, rehab and medical services and a professional football codes in a career which lasts over 2.5 decades. So great to have those people with us here to mull over our topic today. Now, I thought I'd start with you firstly, Jason. Data, we keep hearing about it all the time in modern sport. 25 years or so you've been involved in elite level sport. How has what we've collected data-wise changed in that time?
Well, I think in that 25 years, we've gone from very basic measurements, the stopwatch, video cameras, and just assessing things in a very general nature, to we've gone all the way now to GPS, interactions with force plates, high level or high detail biomechanical analysis. So the data collection has become broadly exponential. And as computing power has increased and technology has reduced in size, that's just continued to accelerate every single year.
And when we're talking about that data, you can collect a lot of it, but do a lot of people actually understand what it means?
I think there's a lot of people who are out there saying they understand it, and probably leading coaches, maybe athletes at some level, down the garden path. Not necessarily the wrong information, but they're not helping the situation. It's getting muddied by a lot of information, and I think the more that we integrate the academic level investigations to give clarity, validity and reliability information, that's where we're getting improving.
Angus, you work in a very technical sport, the sport of pole vault. How much of your training is governed by key performance data that is picked up by data experts, by coaches and the likes, to make you a better athlete?
Yeah. So when I first started pole vault, it was pretty kind of vague. You know, you rock up, coach would just give you a few cues. As my career has kind of progressed, it's got more and more specific and yeah, data driven. We have kind of like an athlete monitoring system, AMS, where we put in all of our training, and that's kind of dictating a lot of the decisions that we make around load management. And then there's a number of kind of parameters that we measure during the actual jump itself, and either those deficits, you know, in some of those variables we address in, you know, the training to improve. Yeah.
How much of your actual training is data-driven? And obviously you do things like running programs, gym and everything like that, but how much of the specific data that is collected is actually important to you and your coaching staff?
So we have a number of like key performance measures. They include contact time, so our feet, and how much load we receive through there, and duration and our perceived intensity. That's kind of broadly. And that creates kind of like a running 6-week average that predicts what we're going to be like in the next 6 weeks. And then we make sure that what we actually record matches that prediction. And then that keeps us honest, basically, and keeps us on track without going, you know, with a big spike in our training load or not doing enough and then deconditioning. So I'd say that most of the decisions are made based on some sort of data point.
Julie, from your perspective with the legal background, we're talking there, Angus is talking about specific data, but also things like sleep, nutrition, everything like that now is sort of being rolled into this sort of elite level sporting program. Do we run the risk of a bit too much of a big brother?
Yeah, I mean, Angus, have you got any kit on you now?
Yeah.
What's it collecting?
Yeah, so this is a sleep monitor.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to wear this for another 2 weeks. I've had one of my training partners wear it for like 2 months now, so yeah, I feel watched.
So do you have concerns about that type of thing?
Well, I think what's interesting is, there's two different types broadly of visible to the athlete and coach data, and then a lot of the back-end collection that's continuous. So the continuous collection of sleep or heart rate, very intimate personal data, and then also the set of companies that are involved in providing the technology. So, there's a bunch of commercial providers that develop various wearable tech, also the GPS trackers that Jay's talked about. So they're all in this space, and I'm concerned that there's the proliferation is in a lot of that invisible stuff. And the reason elite sport's so interesting is probably a couple of reasons. One is we all, whatever happens in elite sport will trickle down. But also if we don't, as fans and enthusiasts of sport with the very particular sort of fairness and integrity and spirit of the game of sport, don't identify where we might be up against boundaries, I think that the big brother that we're, increasingly facing in the rest of our lives is more likely to happen. And when I would characterise sport as this frontier of human monetisation in elite sport, human monitoring for monetisation, marketisation. So that's the battleground, really. And as I've discussed with these guys and others in the sector, it feels like at the moment there's no real sense of any rules that are in play.
Which we will talk about a little bit later in regard to the legal aspects. But Jackie, in your area of research and putting together, we'll talk a little bit in a moment about the bowling accelerometers you've got in regard to looking at bowling techniques with cricketers and the likes. But we know all the time that research facilities at places like universities are always looking for money. And you've had approaches, or the university has approaches from big people like Amazon, Google and the likes. Why is that? Is that for them to be able to get data, or just to try and be good citizens?
Well, undoubtedly, it's about data. Those companies are about data. And there's a uniqueness to, I think, sport, people forget. And just to echo what Julia said about, it's at the frontier. It's at the frontier of a whole range of technological developments, but also data aggregation. And if we think about, we know each other from cricket, we have at UWA, for example, 30 years of cricket, longer really, 30 years of cricket information. What those companies, those large tech titans really need is data to create product and to use machine learning create machine learning models and all those things that people are hearing about that they're a little bit frightened of, but they're also in awe of. Those companies, no matter how much money they can throw at the problem, can't recreate historical data sets of elite athletes. And so that is uniquely an asset to university sectors, and I would argue that it's uniquely an asset to the community. And it's not an asset that should be sold off to those sorts of companies, because it's just something, if they could create it themselves, they wouldn't come to anyone else.
How big a concern is it for someone like you, Angus, if you think of the WA Institute of Sport? You're from the Eastern States, so you've relocated here because the waste program is almost the best in the world, set up by Alex Parnov when they built the new waste facility. There's an indoor pole vault training facility with a roof high enough for you to jump 6 metres. Obviously, all the data collection, everything you have there is truly state-of-the-art and is ahead of most other areas of your sport globally. So how concerned are you in regard to being able to retain all that information yourself for you and your coaches?
Yeah, definitely. We touched on this a bit before when we were chatting. I'm a little bit conflicted. On one end, I kind of like the idea of open source. Everyone has access, and therefore, when it comes down to competition, it really is who is the best, or who has the best resources. And that's, I guess, a fairer game. And yet, as you said, I made some big decisions and choices, not sacrifices, choices, to move over here, put some things on hold, and yeah, I want every edge that I can on the runway.
Have you been asked to give an okay as to what data is collected from you or about you?
Vaguely. It's something that myself, a number of other athletes from a number of other sports are talking about, and currently there really is no answer about where it's being stored, how long it's going to be stored for, questions about encryption, who really owns the data. All of these things make athletes like myself a little bit uncomfortable when the conversations we have about data are very much like, it's a compliant issue, do it, I want you to fill this out, instead of being like, having an explanation as to why we're doing it and empowering us, and also making sure we have the knowledge base so we can make the decision as to whether or not we do want to share, our data. Is it really going to help us that much, or is it going to be used for some other purpose?
Put your legal hat on, Julia. Who does own the data? Who owns Angus's data?
So, like in our everyday life, this, I think, is the biggest unresolved question of this century. The current status is those who grab it exercise rights like ownership. Legally, that's not underpinned by ownership rights, but they, through access and control, act like owners. So to take the AFL example, the AFL, whenever there's a game, any of the 18 clubs, they hook up their tech and all of the players to the AFL's systems and a set of vendors, Catapult, Champions on, and the AFL acts like the owner of it. But when asked, they haven't got any real basis for that. They've just sort of grabbed it. And the risk with the example Jackie used of Google or Amazon sort of looking at profiteering off this data is once they grab it, they'll also act like they own it too. So that's the biggest game, I think, in every aspect of our lives. The use of digital platforms, apps, your mobile phone. This is what data can feel like a very abstracting notion. I mean, it's really everything about you. Your movements, your habits, your sleep, often very intimate details about your home life. And within the sporting context, that can be for an intense period of someone's life. Athletic careers are often quite a bit shorter than other careers. So what happens beyond? So I guess the answer is, I think that the right of individuals is the primary that ought to drive it. And as Angus said, if this is in my interest, then I should be able to use the most advanced technology. And I think that's the sort of reset we need that challenges really the sort of the grabber mentality of once you claim it, that you own it. Who really should it be in the interest of? And I think it's the person who it's all about.
Looking at you, Jason, you've come from a sports science background. You've obviously studied it and got tertiary qualifications. Were there any ethics parts of that, or how important is that really, that if you're dealing in that and you're dealing and collecting in people's data, that as a professional, you really need to be aware of the onus that is on you in regard to how that data is used?
Well, I think that there's two parts to the answer. First is there any discussion about ethics pertaining to data and the like? No, there is not. Not in any shape or form. And then you come into the professional realm, and in the same space, is there a presentation when you join employment with a team? Do they go through data acquisition and security measures, as Angus discussed? Currently in Australia, I'd say it'd be close to 100% of a no. You talk to some of the teams in the US, some of them are extraordinarily protective, but it's more based on a business case as opposed to one of protecting the athlete. It's we want to protect what we have so it doesn't get monetised or scraped for other nefarious sort of gambling or whatever other uses. But within our own profession, there is a growing body of people, probably the older contingent, that are concerned, that have seen the growth of data and are aware that there are certain ethical obligations we have. One of my personal ones is the portability of data. So if an athlete moves from one team to another, it's their data. Okay, they should be able to have that, particularly when we talk in the realms, as Angus implied, about whether that data supports a certain training regime that may keep them safe, and like that information should be transferred. That's now currently, certainly within the AFL, done on a person-to-person basis. It's not, and that's me to my peers. and it's not always accommodated. So there are certainly underlying ethical concerns within my profession.
Talking about ethical concerns, Jackie, the area that you've been working on, we're talking about cricket before. Cricket, in regard to technique, is very unique. There are regulations on things like Formula One and 12-metre yachts and the America's Cup and the likes, but if you're talking about a bowling action, someone's entire livelihood, and also in regard to using the worst word in sport, cheating, can come into it. As you mentioned, you've got 30 years worth of data. I mean, how important is it for that to be protected?
Oh, I mean, it's life-changing for those athletes if some of that is released. All of that was, all of the illegal action data that we collected at the WA was obviously collected under an embargoed type status.
Sorry, but is that a concern when we're talking about the Googles, Amazons, Facebooks of the world?
It is to an extent, and I've discussed this previously with Julia. One of the challenges of those large tech companies, and in fact anyone moving into the more machine learning, artificial intelligence space at the moment, is the loss of domain expertise of the people to understand what that data is. So the context of the data, the nuance of the data. So if a large company like Facebook, for example, bid for the Cricket World Cup in India, and that in my, I mean, I don't know this for sure, but I would suspect that was a first parlay, if you like, into collecting broadcast data that is actually about the actual data set that they were, the vision that they were seeking to obtain rights to. So one of the advantages of that, if you start to look at things like artificial intelligence and machine learning today, is that we can start to understand and run pose models, or what we'd call pose estimations. So for those in the audience listening, wanting to know what that means, it's just when you sort of identify a skeleton, if you like, or a stick figure on that particular image. And we can do that today fairly easily just using straight computer vision techniques. One of the problems with that, so a group like Facebook or Google or any computer vision team at any university, they could do that, and they could do that on all of the historical broadcast data we've ever had. But what they don't understand is how much expertise went into understanding the model that we used to determine if someone was illegal or not. And because the model that we used was, I mean, if I think about it, we probably had 4 PhDs over the course of that time frame, understanding how we model the shoulder joint centre and how we model the elbow joint centre and the axes, because we took that very, very seriously. We were talking about only a few degrees where we got to determine whether someone was able to undertake, to play in the game of cricket, and particularly for individuals, say, from the subcontinent, you're talking about not just that person's livelihood, but entire families and villages in some instances. So those large companies, when they come along with new techniques without understanding the domain expertise, I think that's a real risk.
How much of this is media driven, Julia? That the media just wants to have this information and insight into what athletes are doing?
Yeah, well, I think once you get to sports that are underpinned by a business model of audience engagement, the story that's often sold at the club level to athletes, to coaches, is this is in the interests of performance, it's in the interests of athlete health, injury prevention, these kind of things. But in practice, that is a really minor aspect of the use today. And a lot of the use is putting up the visible versus the invisible. The visible being things like who are the top 5 performers on field, and sort of match stats. We might not have too many issues with that because we can see some of them with our eyes. But behind that are a bunch of details about where did every player go at any point in time, from the GPS tracker, what was their accelerometry data, which can tell you, for example, how many hits have they had, all sorts of very revealing health kind of information. And another example which alarmed me somewhat is broadcasters getting access to facial recognition.
For what reason? We were talking about that off stage. Explain the reason that they wanted that.
So facial recognition is an interesting scientific technique that you can assess in a predictive way some of the micro features of faces that reveal, give away what's going to happen next. So in this case, it was trained on the top 4 tennis players in the world on when they were receiving a serve. Did they look crestfallen or enthusiastic? And then you could make a micro trade in the sort of broader complex of broadcast betting, wagering, on what will happen next. But you know, facial recognition is, I think, a uniquely dangerous technology because you can't get another face. So what is revealed in that is you know, it's impossible to mask. And I think that's a sort of line where we go, well, actually, this is supposed to be about, you know, the limit of human performance accessible by a human, not by these sort of, you know, absolute computer vision, sort of granular detail machines.
Jason, how much of all the data, for example, the Fremantle Football Club when you were there collects, not just to highlight Fremantle, but how much of it is actually used?
Well, I think over the course of a long period of time, so I was there longer than a decade, that ebbed and flowed. So there were times when we were collecting data where, as Jackie indicated, domain knowledge, we probably didn't know what we didn't know. And as a new technology comes in, you need to collect more and determine to the best of your ability what's a reliable source of data, and more than that, the validity. So what does it mean, and is it measuring what you think it's meaning? So over the course of time, I think we reduced things down, but as you go further along, and as Julia pointed out about the depth or the amount of information that's out there, you start to look at more advanced computational methods, as Jackie spoke about, like machine learning and the like, and we start to look for the patterns that we really can't see as humans on the surface, but when you look at the intricate levels of connection between pieces, there's information there. So it then comes down, as we discussed, to what's usable on the other end. So it's okay for us to devise all this great information, but we have to then make it in a usable and understandable, digestible format for coaches who are not typically PhDs in data science to be able to understand, consume that data and apply it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that a little bit. One of the queries I would say, and it's something I've noticed working with many elite teams, professional and otherwise over the years, is there's now this proliferation of data collection. There is a quantum of data out there, and I would argue that, and I've heard this many, many times, that look, we might not know what we'll need it for yet, but if we just collect it and we continue to collect it, something might fall out at some time. And I'd argue that that's a very dangerous premise, because, yeah, that may be true, but at the same time, you're collecting data from people and it's theirs, and it may actually, what they collect today, I think Julia touched on this, for example, the impact data that might occur for any code of football, so a GPS data, for example, in some respects, I could take that data, reverse engineer it, work out how many impacts someone had had, work out their likelihood of a brain injury, which we know is a real problem in football codes, and if I wanted, sell that to an insurer. Now that may not have impact today, but the tendency for elite sport particularly to just collect data for the sake of it is there, and I think we need to stop and reassess why we're collecting it. We have to have purposeness in why we're actually doing that, and because data should only inform, it should never drive.
What do you feel about that, Angus? I mean, does everything that gets done around you and for you, can you see an immediate or short-term area where that is going to be utilised, or you just feel at times a lot of stuff is being aggregated in regard to what you're doing in the gym and in your training facility?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the time I get the instruction of what to fill out, and I do my best to fill that out, and then I kind of lead it. It's starting to change, and I am starting to be involved in more conversations, but I'd really like to be, sitting down with not only the coaches, but, management and then the data scientists themselves, and I'd like them to ask me questions of like what I think is important and get my perspective, and I don't really know if that's been talked about. There's a lot of, management, data scientists, academics that are kind of talking about this, but I think athletes need to be more involved in that conversation. And I think that'll help sift out what data is actually valuable and also hopefully avoid information that athletes could potentially perceive as, negative to their own life.
Glenn.
In your situation, Jason, is it the coaches that go and ask, I'd like data on this, or is it the sports scientists that produce data and say to the coach, I reckon you can use this? Who's the driver behind coming up with data?
Okay, the bulk would probably come from sports science saying we've measured this and we think it can contribute. There are insightful coaches who will come up with observations, say I'd like to know about X, Y and Z, and you do your best to, and that's the ideal way things should work. So the absolute domain specialist says, show me this space, illuminate it for me. But as we move into the era of technology that is, let's say, hardware driven, so there's a lot of information, as Jackie said, being collected that people don't even know how to use. So that's all sitting in the background, and that's where we create that level of information that's a repository that people aren't using. Can coaches use it? They can if they're open to the idea, but there's so much going on, and I think if I reflect back to what Angus just said, Angus is in an individual sport, and so his interaction is on an individual basis. When you have a squad of 50 players, some of which are 18, 19, and they really, with all due respect, don't care. Some do at the highest level, but you've got some kids, just give me the football, just put me out there. We're still collecting information on those people, and the same, if you want to call it respect, should be paid to them in terms of how we handle that data. And that's, as much as it's happening, that conversation may happen for Angus, I can tell you it's not happening right across the spectrum, which is something that we should be considering.
From what you've studied in regard to, Julia, the ethics and the morals and the legalities, where do we sit on the global sort of system? Are we behind in regard to getting the permission of someone like Angus to have his data collected?
Yeah, I think we're currently behind, but we are assessed against a generally pretty open field. And I think, and this is one of our drivers on the research front, I think Australia really has an opportunity to lead. We've led on, in the high performance system that Angus is part of, position statements on genetic testing, how do we make sure that we protect athletes in that sense. We've led in the positions around some of the most controversial decisions that you can make around things like illegal actions and those controversial gender determinations and so on. This is a genuine open field opportunity. We've got a project with the Academy of Science that's interested in this. In professional sport, I know the AIS is leading conversations. But I just wanted to pick up what's so special about this as an instance of, I think, a broader conversation we need to have in Australia. And it's the issue Angus said about, the particularity of him as an athlete and what's unique. And a lot of these big data techniques are all about looking at us en masse and thinking about how do you make mass predictions that are really about finding patterns of homogeneity. And elite sport's all about outliers. Like, I'm interested in the fact that there might be really granular information that you could take from one club to another on that athlete, but that information would reveal, this guy on 3 out of 5 scores doesn't show that he'd be an elite athlete. But then the evidence is he is. And that's the magic, and that's why data is always reductive and models are always insufficient. And I don't know, Angus, if there's, in your case, if that checks out.
Yeah, no, definitely. As we discussed before, I was a bit of an outlier myself. Physically not as gifted in some of, again, the kind of typical testing parameters that are used in athletics, stuff like the standing long jump, 60-metre sprint, all that kind of stuff. But I have other assets that have meant that I can perform with the best in those tests. And personally, I sometimes worry that because some of my data may not be suggestive of, this pure elite athlete that is, very dopamine sensitive, that, is genetically gifted, it might count me out for things like scholarship and support if this gets carried away a bit too much. You talked about genetic testing. I remember there was an attempt for one of my training partners to get genetic testing for him, and because he had recurring tendon pains, and he was able to ultimately he pushed back, because what do they do with that information is, if it's a yes, he has some sort of genetic issue, is that going to somehow hinder him when it comes to funding considerations and whether or not institutions or federations take risks on him and his performance? And yeah, that's our career,
How risky do you see that type of thing from a legal perspective?
Yeah, well, I think that last line, this is the career, this is a workplace. And high stakes decisions, the higher stakes is, are you bowling or are you throwing? And then you're out of the game. But I mean, there's all sorts of micro decisions that are based on what your data reveals. And in other workplaces, I think that I would characterise in sport, what we've got is, it's like for those of us that are office workers, tracking your keystrokes and how much time are you spending on tasks, and are you logged into your social media, or are you checking the news, and using all of that as performance data on what your deliverables are. And I would keep it in that category, that it can, in a very time-sensitive way, potentially be useful, but we should also be getting rid of a lot of it too, like genuinely deleting it. Because as you build up these repositories, they become, uniquely attractive assets. And there's one of the counterparts to Waste has had a tech company come in and scrape its entire database on promise that it's going to provide some, whiz-bang new tech. And you're losing something that you can't recreate, as Jack said, and that will be sold back in ways that is increasingly opaque to the athletes themselves.
In an AFL club, and you've been involved in other professional football codes, Jason, how much protection is there? I mean, are things erased at the end of the day, or is it a repository just continually built up?
Unfortunately, I'm going to tell you that it's relatively unprotected, and to the extent, certainly within Australia, that there are some fields and some groups that data literally, as an employee leaves, they take it with them. And that happens more than you'd like to hear about. And again, that is a fundamental ethical flaw in my peers, so to speak. That's wrong. It's on so many levels, but it does happen.
In the area of, we talked you wrote a moment ago about concussion and head injuries and that. The collection of that data is becoming very, very big nowadays. We've heard of massive legal cases in the NFL in America. We know that the late Polly Farmer, Danny Frawley, their families have donated their brains to medical research. Where does that fall under? Does that fall under health, or does it fall under sport? Because I'd imagine that health would have a far stricter legal parameters in regard to how that information can be used.
Yeah, that's right, Glenn. That's a fantastic question, actually. It's one of the things we're aiming to look at in that Academy of Science project, and primarily because there is this grey band now about health, yes, is really stringently regulated when we know it's medical and health data, and that will generally apply to any medical official in a sports team. But for people like myself, so sports biomechanists, exercise physiologists, etc., the data that we collect may not today be considered medical or health data, just like the GPS data that we talked about before. But in my opinion, it could very well be considered medical data 5 to 10 years from now, because it actually gives you information about the health status of an individual. And this is really relevant to people in the general community as well. Where people think, oh, we're talking about GPS, tracking and those sorts of things. But to touch on what Julia said, those same sensors that you see on those athletes that are on those harnesses are exactly the same sensors that are in your mobile phone. So those things that we can calculate, like how long did you sit at your desk, when did you go to the toilet, we could take that information from your mobile phone right now if you had it when you're in your workplace and calculate those very same things that we're talking about today for athletes.
So Julie, we're talking about the collection, say, of information for CTE concussion. Does sport and the way that they collect data and regulate data need to come with the same sort of legal parameters and legal safeguards that health collection does?
I think it's increasingly the case that a lot of personal information is revealing of health. So the mobile phone example, you could probably also look at gait.
Oh, yeah, I could take that same mobile phone and determine your likelihood of developing knee osteoarthritis with about 65% accuracy, which is better than chance.
Yeah, so I mean, there's these categories that are well protected, and a lot of crude measures of what is medical data, like did a doctor get involved? But if you've got these other features and it was a researcher, it somehow falls out of the category, or someone on the performance team. So yeah, I think we need to level it up. And you know, if we leveled it up, I also think we'd get more of the rich athlete-oriented research that would be really valuable. You take the outlier, you get quite integrated, you know, very specific to that athlete, and restore that sense that the first and primary source and beneficiary of this information is the individual that it's about. And because most of it will bleed into, I think it's probably not 5 years away, it might already be here that a lot of this is health, could be classified health information. The legal test is, could it, is it personal? Could it be identified to an individual? So even if you anonymise stuff, often it can be re-identified. And if it's health, can it be used to inform the health of that person? So it's not that it got collected by a doctor.
We obviously had the biggest profile case, I guess, in recent times in Australian sport with what happened at the Essendon Football Club, where players were asked to sign certain documentation, and then we still probably don't know all these years on what was actually administered to them. But you've worked with Jason, say, at the Fremantle Football Club. You're working with 17, 18-year-olds that are coming into a system. You're working with the David Mundys and years gone by, the Pavliches that are well in the back half of their 30s. Do they all ask the same questions? Or are some of them just, you're in an AFL system and whatever I'm told to do, I'm just going to do?
I'd reflect back to what I said about Angus as an example. You have players at one end of the spectrum that are incredibly engaged and across every detail and want to spend time on it. There are others in the bulk in the middle who are kind of interested, but it's a passing. And then you have another end of the distribution that really don't care. That being said, understanding where those players fit in that, we still have to treat them all the same. And whether we verbally have engagement with them about what data is used for, the back end and the ethics, that need to, in my opinion, start with the people like myself, the practitioners that are making ethical decisions about what we collect. And if you use the Essendon example, there were ethical grey zones, or I would say lines that were crossed. And the same example could be extrapolated to data. So how far would you go? You know, there's certain points where you need to say, this is where we're stopping, and that's it. Now, is that relying on the professional as an individual, or should it be, like the medical profession, here's the line, do not cross? And that's probably what we're starting to explore now, is where does that sit? We're a very young profession. If you term sports scientists or even the strength conditioning, we're young professionals, a young profession that has been impacted by a radical increase in data. So the use and control of it's very unknown.
Julie, from a legal perspective, what right does an 18-year-old have when he comes into, say, a football team? And this is the way we've always done things. This is the data that's being collected. Obviously, they feel that they're under pressure because they want to conform, they want to get a game, they want to stay on an AFL list. But what is their actual legal, not so much legal requirement, but what can they do in that regard if they have a degree of uncomfortability with it?
Yeah, so I think there's law and culture. And the cultural element is you're probably not going to get a game unless you wear the kit. Talking in footy, I think it's only the most prominent players that were able to resist wearables, and now it's kind of largely accepted. I guess I think basically the decisions are made by sort of passing consent and then coercion. You know, this is how it goes. This is the same for everybody. And it's very similar to how we all interact with digital technology. You can click, yes, I agree, or you can be a digital pariah and, not communicate with your mates and not find out how the world is moving. And I think that the way to solve that is at the collective and societal level. So you use the example, Jason, of American clubs being more sophisticated at some level. And that's because of two things. One is their regulatory environment is so poor that they operate within it, and because they have these business drivers. And we don't think of sport, I don't think, in such a transactional way. But what serves athletes in the US and what does a modest degree of protection here is collective bargaining agreements and system level changes. And those system level changes have to draw some of those lines, I think, because it's not fair to put on a 17, 18-year-old to say, I don't know what you're going to do with it, but I don't think I feel comfortable. They're not in an empowered environment, and it's a really asymmetric dynamic. So I think that the societal level things could do some things like, first of all, this is in the athlete's interest first and foremost. They should be able to port the data if you move from the East Coast to the West, if you move clubs, and also set some of the rules that say things like facial recognition, incredibly controversial. You need, very explicit buy-in, and you need to stop doing it after a certain amount of time because of the consequences beyond.
Jackie, we're talking about products, I suppose it is a product in some ways, that can cost millions, if not tens of millions of dollars to be able to perfect. Sport is all about a level playing field, as best you can, like versus like. How big a danger is it that there will be some countries, there will be some individual clubs within a particular sport that can actually afford all this type of technology, can also work with research scientists to be able to develop the technology? Is that going to leave us with a very uneven playing field? If we talk about drugs in sport, what you put in your body, there are set limitations, set rules, and you can be ousted from the sport. Are we going to see something similar in regard to large tech?
I think so. And I think when we think about the notion of fair play today, and if you talk to the Sports Integrity Authority, for example, they really are concentrating on things like drugs or any physiological change, and then sports themselves will regulate mechanical advantage, so that cycling will have its own rules, Formula One has its own rules. But right now, the biggest advantage for a sports team or a club or an association, I think, is the data that they collect, and it's actually entirely unregulated. So it wouldn't come in under a soft cap, for example. I wouldn't imagine it in an AFL perspective, depending on how they decided to nominate where that person sat within that cap. But also we can do some really remarkable things with that data now. We can start to integrate data from a performance analytics perspective that might relate to motion on a field and events on a field. And we are doing that today, where we're looking at predicting what is the next thing that is likely to happen. What is the next chain of events that is likely to happen? So then if you're at the forefront of that as a team that has decided early on to invest in data analytics, then good luck to you. You're actually, you've got that competitive edge. And I think from a cultural perspective, that's really interesting, because in sport we think, well, if you're at the front and you're doing those things, then you're being innovative and therefore you should be entitled to do that. And I'm not really sure that that's exactly where we want to be, because that presupposes that everyone has access to the same type of data, the same expertise in that data. There's a whole range of limitations on the assumption that everyone has equal access. And I thought Julia can...
Yeah, well, the funny thing about it is, from your starting point, Glenn, if you took a drug and you said, I can predict the next chain of events that's going to happen, we'd all go, that's clearly off limits. But somehow, because it's in the sphere of the intangible, it's just data. And I, maybe we need to talk about it with a different word than data, that really starts to make it feel as invasive as substances or as significant as the mechanical regulation.
Do you think in the end, Jason, we can get that bigger advantage? The wind's picking up. That bigger advantage from just sports science in regard to being able to take yourself light years ahead or create a strong enough gap between you and those that can't afford that type of information?
Yeah, obviously there are limitations within Australian sport with soft caps and the like. So I think there's probably some restrictions there. But from a broader sense, you used the example when we were discussing earlier about Australia too. So there was a massive jump, right? So we don't know yet. There are some of the work Jackie's discussing that we're currently already working on. It goes beyond the understanding. It's very hard for for the coaches and the like to comprehend. But if someone gets it, and we've got the computational power and the integration to bring good information, yes, it will be a jump, but it's going to take coordination with people, domain knowledge, as Jackie talked about earlier, but certainly the technical input from the appropriate level data scientists and the like will make a difference.
Angus, in your sport and your coaches and your sports scientists, how busy are they trying to find information from other areas around the world to I mean, obviously, as you said before, you have a bit of a feeling conflicted that, you know, you want to see the sport grow, you want to see records increase, but then again, you want to make sure that you're probably the one that's doing it, especially at Tokyo next year.
Yeah.
But how much work is being done behind the scenes by your support group to try and gather information and data from other people overseas?
I think, at least in the sport of pole vault specifically, and within the context of the program at WACE, we're actually we are at the forefront, and we're kind of creating these data sets, and to do so, we're having to draw from other pretty kind of random studies all over the world that indicate, oh, this might indicate performance because we've seen a bunch of, you know, people that jump really high do this. Or maybe everyone that jumps high happens to run fast, so maybe let's look at that. And then reading studies in other sports. So a lot of the time, in the WA sporting culture, we're referenced to football as well, which is great. So I think for now they are looking at other data sets to inform how we kind of measure ourselves. But I just hope that doesn't take away from the magic of, at the end of the day, it's me on the runway and I'm looking at that bar and I'm not thinking like, oh, okay, am I going to be 0.1 faster? Get over, that's all I'm focused on. And yeah, I just hope the magic isn't kind of like sucked out of the sport and it becomes this predictive sort of space. That's not exciting.
I think to pick up on that, it's interesting that over the last 2 years I've watched large national sporting organisations align with the big tech companies in order to, rather than look elsewhere at the level that we would normally have done so at a research level and at a domain, so as say for myself, sports biomechanics. For example, in July last year, Swimming Australia aligned with Amazon AWS to give them all of the access to their data in order to get analytics. So they're using that for sports analytics, performance analytics assessment. And I think ongoing, that's actually what we'll see, because there's somewhat of a, particularly in Australia, but worldwide, there is a lot of money in data and sports data, and there is a lot of money in sport, but much of it does not flow back to the sport itself. And so they need to rely on other groups in order to get they can't afford. Swimming Australia as a semi-professional sport, as an example, needs to buy in that expertise, and within that they're caught between a rock and a hard place. They have to use those really large companies, but in doing so, we are perhaps giving away national assets.
And just to wrap up before we see there's any questions, just to finish with you, Julia, from a legal perspective, Cambridge Analytica was a massive story when data was being leaked. Are we potentially sitting on a powder keg from a sports point of view that something very similar could happen in the sporting domain?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the Essendon example we referred to, when you've got an entire industry where a conversation doesn't ever happen, it may happen right at the signing point, and then ongoing you're collecting the most intimate information about people. I think a powder keg is a great way of putting it. And I think it also will shortchange us on the innovation that could happen. We've seen a few data scandals, they're just breaches, and they haven't been on core athlete medical information and so on. But you want to get ahead of it so that we can, I think, doing this sort of innovation, competitive edge in a principled way and taking the time to get the settings right doesn't mean you're stopping innovation. It's how you save it, actually, to stop the crisis and then build what is really sustainable.
Just before we wrap up, do we have any questions from anyone here at all? We've got a couple of mics if necessary.
Hello.
An interesting discussion. Thank you.
Just thank you very much. Not a question, just to say that what you've been saying is very disturbing, and I would really love to see this panel or a similar panel discuss this on the national media, because I'm sure there are an awful lot of sports fans out there who have no idea what's happening, certainly at the professional level, but also at the level of waste, especially with the young athletes like our pole vaulter here. Yeah, it's disturbing, and I'm not going away from this feeling very happy, but thank you.
Well, I must say, to be perfectly honest, when I was approached to actually facilitate this panel, having been involved in sports broadcasting for over 30 years, when I started to speak to people, fellow panellists here, I was something I'd never ever thought about, never ever really thought about, Julian. I wonder whether, if I'm someone that's had a fair involvement in the level of sport, I wonder how many other people in sport really haven't considered it, and that's why we potentially are sitting on a powder keg.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's so powerful about it is there might be people who don't care about sport, but I've never met one. And we are a sporting nation, and we have been leaders in sport for our whole history. So this is a real opportunity for us to grab, to say, for the protection and endurance of our young athletes, and for all of us in the way that it trickles down into community and grassroots sport, that we need better settings. We need some settings. And there's lots of ways that you can do that. You can have better training. We can, as an industry, set code of conduct. I think it's part of the professionalism of the sport to really up the game on this. And then to leverage our unique research capabilities to be able to do the best work on what is outliers that are individual repositories, and put that power back in athletes' hands.
Anyone else with a question or comment? No? Oh. So if you ask the question, I'll relay it. Okay, the question from the lady here was how much information is collected and used the ice hockey example, the NHL, in America, where they're collecting a lot of data and information that can then lead to health, well-being, and in particular injuries. Do you have much of an idea about that, Jackie, in Australian sport, whether that is being looked upon greatly? In particular, I'll get Jason in a moment to talk about it as well.
I might let Jason answer just from the pure medical, and then I'll answer from a performance position, because most data, that particularly the large high-resolution data we get today, is really supposed to help athletes, but it's actually not collected under a medical domain. But
I think from a medical perspective, if I drift towards drafting and bringing young players in, I think the medical data that's collected is at the highest level of protection, and purely to ascertain the health of the athlete, and it's used at the highest order. So I wouldn't have any concerns in that regard. I think the extrapolation would be that when you go down to, let's say, the draft testing, which is kind of where Angus was going, that, okay, we run these 5 tests that some self-proclaimed person said they're the right test, that those 5 tests, if someone didn't do well on them, okay, we won't draft him, when in fact he might be a superstar. This year's Brownlow medal winner, Lachie Neale, was pick 54, so he's way down the draft. Why was he so low? So I think medically very ethical and at the highest order protecting the athlete, but I think there are possibly down the track other pieces of information that may, as Angus indicate, may impact future selection and the like.
So, but with respect to data that we might collect more, so it could be accelerometry data or it could be a whole range of things. If your question is about how much of that data is used to inform things like team selection, then some of that might be, and Jason again would probably say some of that is definitively used for that. But with respect to, say, things like sports injury risk and injury prevention, it's a really interesting space, because almost in all cases at the elite level and professional sport level or national sporting organisations where I sit on panels, etc., where they say we would like to collect large amounts of data because it might be able to tell us who might obtain an injury. So let us collect all this data because it might be able to inform that. I can tell you, I can't think of really one example, and I work in that space in terms of, and I've worked for a long time in something like predicting anterior cruciate ligament injuries. There is always this hope that we might be able to do it, but I can't tell you one where we can currently use data that we definitively know if we get this level of information, and it maybe we'll throw it into a machine learning, and everyone says, oh, machine learning, it's going to save our health, it's going to save lives. It doesn't. It can currently improve diagnostic tools perhaps, but there is no example I can give you where it actually we can take that data and say this will reduce an Achilles tendon injury in Angus. There's not one of those examples. And I think Julia feels fairly strongly about that objection.
I was just going to say, one of the failing assumptions of the models that we create, like Jackie was talking about, is that we've collected all the pertinent information, that we have everything, which we don't, right? That's the main flaw. So if we start from that perspective, that we don't know everything about it, and we shouldn't. And sometimes it's the sleep thing, it's recovery. If someone got emotional problems because they're having relationship problems at home, all those things can impact the human organism. So I agree with Jackie. I mean, we can't predict a lot of those things. We can identify some probability changes maybe, but going down that path that we absolutely know is flawed from the get-go.
Julia?
I was just thinking, so often when it comes to the use of tech or, advanced methods, we have this benefits and risks seeming calculus. And it's amazing. The benefit side always seems to get away with no evidence. And the risk side, you can count them up. And I think in life and in sport, we shouldn't keep that, seeming equal balance. If you can't show me the evidence that it is actually doing the primary thing that you're saying it'll do, and we see this, the national government's got all sorts of things, drones, AI, it's got benefits and risks, and then you point to, show me the evidence on the benefits, it's really very modest. And I think there's plenty of ways that we can work up really defensible examples if we start small. Don't just test in the wild, don't collect because you can. But it's a shift, and it's also about having confidence. I think anyone who'd listen here today, you can get your head around it. And so often tech feels like this conversation for experts, but it's not. It's for all of us, and we can all sort of collectively be part of that line drawing.
Well, time for us to wrap up. Julie's finished on a good note talking about experts. We've had 4 of them with us here today, giving us a real inside perspective in regard to the technology, the data that we are collecting, and indeed how it's being used, how it should be used, and where it will be used in the future. So can we please thank Jackie, Angus, Julia and Jason, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.